Picture this. You are 12 years old, standing barefoot on cold marble floors in the heart of Topkapi Palace, Constantinople, in the year 1573. The scent of jasmine and rosewater cannot mask the underlying smell of fear that clings to these walls like incense. Your small hands tremble as silk-clad women with eyes like daggers circle you, their whispers sharp as broken glass in languages you don't understand. The morning light filters through latticed windows, casting geometric shadows across your face. The last time sunlight will touch you freely for years, perhaps forever. A voice cuts through the perfumed air, spoken in accented Turkish that you're already forgetting how to resist. Forget your name. The words hang in the air like a death sentence. The woman before you, draped in emerald silk with a headdress that catches the light like trapped stars, watches your face for the moment your old self dies. Behind her, dozens of girls stand in perfect rows, their eyes vacant, their postures identical. They were once daughters, sisters, beloved children with names their mothers sang as lullabies. Now they are nothing but potential. You want to scream that you are Anastasia, that your father grows wheat in the hills outside Belgrade, that your mother braids flowers into your hair during summer festivals. But the words die in your throat as you notice the girls who refuse to let go of their old names. They bear marks, scars on their wrists, a finger missing, eyes that have seen punishments your mind cannot yet comprehend. But this command to forget is just the beginning. Before you learn where you'll sleep, what you'll eat, or even which direction leads back to the world you knew, you must survive the first rule that governs this silken prison. A rule so absolute that breaking it doesn't just mean punishment, it means disappearance. What you don't yet understand is that you've entered a machine designed to strip away everything human about you and reshape what remains into something useful. The Ottoman Harem wasn't a palace of pleasure as European fantasies would have you believe. It was a factory for manufacturing power, and you are the raw material. And the first lesson in your transformation begins with a single word: silence. Before we dive into this forgotten world of shadows and silk, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible how we're connected across centuries by these dark tales of power and survival. The silence isn't just quiet, it's a living thing that wraps around your throat like silk cord, tightening with each breath. You learn this within your first hour, when a girl no older than yourself whispers a prayer in what sounds like Greek. The punishment comes swift and without warning. Two older women, their faces carved from marble, drag her screaming from the room. Her cries echo through the corridors until they don't. She returns 3 days later with her voice box crushed, speaking only in gestures that spell out her new obedience. In this world of whispers, your native tongue becomes your first casualty. Serbian dies on your lips, replaced by Turkish phrases hammered into your skull through repetition and pain. But it's not just language they're stealing, it's the very sounds of your homeland. The way your grandmother hummed while kneading bread, the songs your brother sang while mending nets, the specific cadence of your father's voice calling you in for supper. All of it must die to make room for what they will build in its place. The older girls, the ones who've survived long enough to earn positions of minor authority, enforce the silence with religious fervor. They understand what you don't yet, that every word from your old life is a thread connecting you to a world that no longer exists for you. These threads must be cut, one by one, until you float free in this perfumed prison, belonging nowhere but here. You discover that silence has its own language. The way a girl holds her shoulders when the Black Eunuch walks by. The quick glance that warns of an approaching inspection. The subtle hand gesture that means someone didn't return from the Sultan's chambers. This wordless communication becomes your lifeline. The only way to navigate the invisible currents of favor and fear that determine who rises and who simply vanishes. But as your voice dies and your new vocabulary takes root, you begin to understand a terrible truth. Silence isn't the cruelest rule you'll face. It's merely preparation for what comes next. The rule that will break your will more completely than losing your voice ever could. The rule of absolute, unquestioning obedience. Your body becomes a stranger to itself under their sculpting hands. Every morning before dawn breaks over the Bosphorus, you stand with the other novices as senior concubines reshape your very bones through brutal discipline. Your spine must curve at precisely the right angle when bowing. Your eyes must find the floor the moment any authority enters the room. Your hands must fold in a specific pattern that signals submission while hiding the tremor of fear that never quite goes away. The training begins with walking. Not the casual stride of a peasant girl crossing fields, but the gliding movement of a ghost across water. Bowls of water balanced on your head spill if you move too quickly, too abruptly, too humanly. The punishment for spillage is to clean the marble floors with your own hair until it bleeds from your scalp, teaching your body that grace isn't a gift, it's survival. Zainab, a concubine who rose to the rank of third consort before falling from favor, oversees your transformation with the dedication of a master craftsman working precious metal. Her own story serves as both inspiration and warning. She bore the Sultan's son only to watch him die of fever, sending her tumbling down the hierarchy like a stone down a well. Now she channels her loss into creating perfection from the raw material of frightened girls. She teaches you that obedience isn't just following orders, it's anticipating desires before they're spoken. The slight tension around the Sultan's eyes means he wants music. The way he holds his teacup suggests he desires poetry rather than dance. Missing these subtle cues means disappointing someone whose pleasure or displeasure can determine whether you eat this week or disappear entirely. You learn to read the moods of the Black Eunuchs like weather patterns, understanding that Qasim's heavy footsteps mean someone will be punished today, while Mehmet's humming suggests the Sultan is pleased and rewards might trickle down to the lower ranks. These men, themselves carved into something neither male nor female by their master's needs, understand power in ways that cut deeper than any blade. The senior concubines drill responses into your muscle memory until your body moves without conscious thought. Prostrate yourself when the Sultan enters. Never turn your back on royalty. Keep your eyes downcast unless specifically commanded to look up. Each rule carries the weight of absolute law, because in this palace of silken shadows, disobedience doesn't lead to punishment, it leads to erasure. But as your body learns to dance to their tune and your mind begins to predict their demands, you start to understand that all this training, all this breaking and rebuilding serves a single purpose. You're being prepared for a competition more vicious than gladiatorial combat, where the prize is survival and the cost of losing is becoming a footnote in a story no one will ever tell. Because in the Ottoman Harem, rules alone don't determine your fate. What matters is where you stand on the ladder of power, and every rung above you is slick with the blood of girls who climb too fast, too carelessly, or not carefully enough. The hierarchy reveals itself like layers of an onion, each one more precious and more poisonous than the last. At the bottom, where you now tremble, are the odalisques, girls so new that their terror still smells fresh on their skin. You wear simple cotton, sleep on hard divans, and exist solely to learn the rules that govern this vertical world. Above you stretch 6 ascending levels of power, each representing years of survival, cunning, and luck that statistics suggest you'll never possess. The first promotion, if you can call advancement in a prison a promotion, elevates you to Shagird, a student concubine who has mastered the basic arts of invisibility and obedience. These girls wear silk instead of cotton and sleep on cushions instead of bare wood. More importantly, they've earned the right to speak when spoken to, a privilege that feels like breathing after months of enforced silence. But with speech comes danger, because every word you utter is weighed for signs of intelligence, ambition, or worst of all, independent thought. Gozda's status marks the first taste of real influence. These favorite ones have caught the Sultan's eye, not necessarily for their beauty, though that helps, but for their ability to become whatever he needs them to be in any given moment. Contemporary accounts describe Gozda who could recite Persian poetry while massaging away the tension of military defeats, or sing Bulgarian folk songs while the Sultan grieved his mother's death. They understand that power in the harem flows not from what you are, but from what you can make others feel. The leap to Iqbal, fortunate one, usually requires sharing the Sultan's bed and surviving the experience without showing either disgust or excessive pleasure. Both reactions mark you as unsuitable for advancement. Ottoman court records suggest that many girls reach this level only to be quietly transferred to provincial harems, their potential deemed insufficient for the capital's demands. Those who remain master the art of passionate detachment, providing intimacy without emotional connection, pleasure without personal investment. But it's the rank of Kaden that separates the survivors from the legends. These 4 women, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 1st Kaden, wield influence that extends far beyond the harem walls. They correspond with provincial governors, influence trade agreements, and most crucially, they bear sons. In Ottoman succession law, every prince is a potential sultan, which means every Kadin is a potential Valide Sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire. The ascension of Hurrem Sultan from Ukrainian slave to Hasaki Sultan, the Sultan's legal wife, broke 6 centuries of Ottoman tradition and rewrote the rules of imperial power. Court chroniclers describe her rise with a mixture of admiration and horror, noting how she allegedly arranged the deaths of rivals through a network of loyal servants armed with poisons so subtle that victims appeared to die of natural causes. She didn't just climb the hierarchy, she rebuilt it around herself, creating the position of Hasaki specifically to legitimize her unprecedented influence. But even Hurrem, at the height of her power, remained one death away from irrelevance. The ultimate prize in this vertical world belongs to the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. This woman rules not just the harem but holds sway over the empire's domestic and foreign policy. She controls the treasury, approves marriages among the nobility, and can override her son's decisions through a complex web of influence that makes her effectively the power behind the throne. Yet between every girl and her ascension stands a figure more feared than the sultan himself, more dangerous than any rival concubine, more absolute in his power than the empire's enemies. The Black Eunuchs, who control access, information, and life itself within these walls, answer to no earthly authority save their own carefully cultivated sense of divine mission. Standing between every girl and her future was someone far more feared than the sultan, the chief Black Eunuch, whose word could elevate a slave to royalty or erase a queen from history with equal ease. In the shadow world of the imperial harem, power flows through hands that will never know the touch they control. The chief Black Eunuch, known as the Kislar Agassi, holds keys that unlock more than just doors. They control destinies, manipulate futures, and decide which girls will see tomorrow's sunrise. These men, castrated in childhood and surviving the brutal journey from African slave markets, understand power in its purest form because they can never possess its most basic expression. The current Kislar Agassi, Hakim Mustafa A, glides through the marble corridors like smoke given form. His silk robes whisper secrets as he moves, and girls press themselves against walls when they see his shadow approaching. He maintains detailed records of every concubine's behavior, tracking not just their actions but their expressions, their friendships, their dreams muttered during restless sleep. Nothing happens in the harem without his knowledge, and his favor can transform a forgotten odalisque into a sultan's favorite overnight. These eunuchs exist in a liminal space that makes them incredibly dangerous. Neither fully male nor female, belonging neither to the world of men nor women, they've learned to derive their power from their unique position as guardians of both purity and corruption. Court records suggest that the Black Eunuchs often knew which girls would be chosen for the Sultan's bed days before the selection, using this information to extract favors, loyalty, and absolute obedience from desperate concubines. The surveillance system they've created turns every girl into both observer and observed. Junior concubines report on their seniors' conversations. Senior concubines monitor the junior ones for signs of rebellion or unusual intelligence. The eunuchs weave these reports into detailed psychological profiles that determine everything from meal portions to sleeping arrangements, to which girls simply disappear during the night, their absence noted only by slightly fewer place settings at morning prayers. Allegedly, some girls vanished so completely that their names were struck from all palace records, as though they had never existed. European diplomats occasionally inquired about specific young women who had been captured during border raids or naval encounters, only to be told that no such persons had ever resided in the imperial palace. The Black Eunuchs had perfected the art of administrative murder, killing people by erasing their documentation, their histories, their very existence from official memory. The power of life and death these castrated men wielded came not from violence, though violence was certainly available, but from their ability to control information. A whispered word to the Sultan about a concubine's Christian sympathies could result in her quiet transfer to a distant province. A suggestion that another girl possessed unnatural appetites might see her walled up alive in the palace foundations, her screams becoming part of the building's acoustic character. Yet the eunuch's authority carried its own terrible cost. Cut off from the fundamental human experiences of family and progeny, they poured their truncated humanity into the exercise of absolute control over others. European observers noted that the chief Black Eunuch often developed obsessive relationships with particular concubines, not romantic or physical, but something more disturbing, a paternal possessiveness that treated human beings as collectible objects to be preserved, displayed, or discarded, according to aesthetic principles only they understood. If you want to understand the full horror of how these men were created, the brutal castration process that killed 9 out of 10 boys, and the psychological transformation that turned victims into perpetrators, I have a complete documentary on the Black Eunuch system that reveals how the Ottoman Empire's greatest servants were forged in humanity's darkest fire. But even if you navigated their constant surveillance, even if you earned their provisional approval, even if you learned to read their moods and anticipate their demands, the ultimate test still awaited. Because surviving the Black Eunuch's scrutiny only earned you the right to face a far more capricious judge, the Sultan himself, whose choice could elevate you to unimaginable heights or destroy you more completely than any eunuch's displeasure ever could. The ritual of selection transforms ordinary evening into theater of the absurd, where young women perform their humanity for an audience of one while knowing that their performance might be their last. When Sultan Murad III decides to expand his attentions beyond his current favorites, the harem erupts into barely contained chaos, dressed as ceremony. Girls who have spent months or years in careful preparation suddenly find themselves stripped, bathed, perfumed, and dressed like sacrificial offerings for a god whose appetites change with his digestion. The preparation begins at sunset in the marble baths, where steam rises like incense around dozens of naked forms. Servants scrub away not just dirt but identity itself, using pumice stones to remove calluses that might remind the Sultan of these girls' peasant origins. Rose oil and jasmine essence anoint skin that will either become a pathway to power or a monument to forgotten dreams. Hair receives architectural attention, braided, pinned, and decorated with gems that cost more than most families earn in a lifetime. The chosen candidates emerge from this industrial beautification looking like living dolls, their humanity polished away until only surface remains. They walk in perfect silence through corridors lined with hundreds of their sisters, each step measured to display grace while hiding terror. The unchosen watch with expressions carefully balanced between envy and relief, understanding that tonight's elevation might become tomorrow's execution. Contemporary accounts from Venetian ambassadors describe the Sultan's selection process as eerily methodical. Murad would examine each candidate like a horse trader, evaluating stock, checking teeth, examining posture, testing reflexes and responsiveness to commands. He looked for signs of intelligence that might prove useful, beauty that would enhance his reputation, and submission deep enough to survive the psychological destruction that intimacy with absolute power required. The girls who caught royal attention learned that being chosen wasn't the victory their competitors imagined. Ottoman court records suggest that many concubines suffered severe psychological trauma from their encounters with sultans who saw them as extensions of their own will rather than separate beings. Some never recovered from the experience of being treated as animated furniture in their own violation, their bodies used while their minds were expected to remain grateful and empty. But the real cruelty of the selection process wasn't what happened to the chosen. It was what happened to those who were ignored. Girls who had spent years perfecting their arts, mastering languages, developing talents that might please imperial tastes, could watch their entire investment in survival become worthless in the space between heartbeats. A sultan's indifference was more devastating than his displeasure, because displeasure at least acknowledged existence. The competition among concubines for these moments of imperial attention allegedly drove some to desperate measures that make modern psychological warfare seem gentle by comparison. Court physicians reported treating girls for mysterious illnesses that struck just before selection ceremonies, symptoms that often resembled poisoning but could never be proven. Rivals would allegedly spread whispers about each other's hygiene, intelligence, or hidden disabilities, turning the harem into an echo chamber of calculated cruelty. One account from the reign of Ahmed I describes a selection ceremony where 3 girls who had been close friends systematically destroyed each other's chances through carefully planted rumors. The first suggested the second had Christian sympathies. The second implied the third suffered from epilepsy. The third revealed the first's secret attempts to correspond with her family in Georgia. All 3 were quietly transferred to provincial harems, their friendship and their futures equally sacrificed to ambition that consumed everything it touched. The psychological pressure of these periodic selections created a permanent state of performance anxiety that aged girls rapidly and destroyed their capacity for genuine human connection. Every conversation became a potential intelligence report, every friendship a possible betrayal, every kindness a strategic calculation. The selection process didn't just choose concubines, it manufactured them, turning young women into weapons aimed at their own humanity. Yet surviving the Sultan's attention, whether positive or negative, was only the beginning of the real competition. Because in the Ottoman imperial system, power didn't flow from beauty, intelligence, or even royal favor. It came from one source alone: the ability to produce male heirs who might someday rule an empire that stretched across 3 continents. Pregnancy in the imperial harem wasn't a natural biological process. It was warfare conducted through the most intimate human functions. Every concubine understood that her womb represented the only path from slavery to sovereignty, but that same potential made her a target for elimination by rivals who saw her fertility as their own death sentence. The moment a girl's monthly bleeding ceased, she entered a deadly game where motherhood meant power and barrenness meant disappearance. The medical supervision of pregnant concubines reveals the calculated nature of imperial reproduction. Palace physicians monitored not just the health of expectant mothers, but their emotional states, dietary habits, and social interactions with scientific precision. These doctors understood that stress, fear, and deliberate sabotage could end pregnancies as effectively as any physical attack. So they created elaborate protocols to shield pregnant women from the psychological warfare that defined daily harem life. Allegations of deliberate miscarriage induction through poison, trauma, or magical practices appear throughout Ottoman palace records with disturbing frequency. Court investigators documented cases where pregnant concubines' food showed traces of pennyroyal and other abortifacient herbs, though proving intentional poisoning proved nearly impossible in an environment where everyone had motive and opportunity. One particularly detailed investigation from 1597 describes a concubine named Aisha who lost 3 consecutive pregnancies under suspicious circumstances before suffering a complete mental breakdown that left her unable to recognize her own reflection. The protection protocols for valuable pregnancies transformed the harem into a medical fortress, where pregnant concubines lived under constant surveillance by loyal servants, trusted eunuchs, and specialized physicians. These women ate from sealed containers, drank only water that had been blessed by palace imams, and moved through the complex surrounded by guards whose job was to prevent not escape but assassination. Contemporary European observers noted that pregnant concubines often developed symptoms resembling battlefield neurosis, jumping at unexpected sounds, refusing to sleep without light, and exhibiting profound paranoia about food, drink, and physical contact. The contrast between successful and unsuccessful pregnancies tells the story of harem politics in its most raw form. Hurrem Sultan allegedly celebrated each of her 6 successful pregnancies by hosting elaborate feasts where she would toast the health of her unborn children, while surrounded by barren rivals who smiled and applauded their own irrelevance. Court chroniclers report that she would place her hands on her swelling belly and make pointed remarks about how Allah blessed the faithful, while punishing the secretly disloyal, comments that drove some of her rivals to attempt desperate measures that usually resulted in their own destruction. The fate of concubines who failed to conceive, or who produced only daughters, illustrates the mathematical cruelty of imperial succession. Palace records show that barren women were systematically relegated to service positions within the harem before being quietly married to loyal officers and exiled to distant provinces where they lived out their days as monuments to wasted potential. One documented case involves a concubine named Gulnar, who served Sultan Ahmed I for 7 years without conceiving, eventually being married to a 60-year-old garrison commander in Damascus, and never mentioned in palace records again. But even successful pregnancy offered no guarantee of advancement, because the harem's power structure depended not just on producing children, but on keeping them alive in an environment where infant mortality served political purposes. Palace physicians' records suggest that children born to lower-ranking concubines died from fevers and breathing difficulties at rates that defied statistical probability, while the offspring of favored wives enjoyed mysteriously robust health, despite being exposed to the same environmental conditions. The psychological toll on mothers who understood that their children's lives depended on political calculations rather than medical care created a generation of women who viewed their own offspring as both salvation and curse. European diplomats reported observing concubines who refused to hold their newborns for fear of becoming too attached to children they might lose to palace politics. While others developed obsessive protective behaviors that bordered on madness, the birth of male heirs triggered celebrations that masked desperate political maneuvering as various factions within the harem attempted to position themselves advantageously relative to potential future sultans. A concubine who bore a son found herself suddenly surrounded by allies seeking to curry favor with the mother of a possible emperor, while her former friends transformed into enemies who understood that her child's existence diminished their own offspring's chances of survival and succession. Yet for every success story like Hurrem Sultan, who parlayed her fertility into unprecedented power, hundreds of other women discovered that pregnancy was merely the first test in a competition that continued until death. Because bearing sons brought time and influence, but it didn't guarantee survival in a system designed to eliminate all but the most ruthlessly adaptable. Most concubines learned this truth too late to save themselves, but just in time to understand how completely they had been erased from a story that continued without them. The machinery of institutional forgetting operated with bureaucratic efficiency that would impress modern totalitarian regimes. When a concubine fell from favor, lost her usefulness, or simply became inconvenient, the Ottoman administrative apparatus could erase her from existence with methodical precision. Names were struck from palace registers. Portraits were removed from official collections and destroyed, and personal effects were redistributed among remaining residents as though their original owners had never existed. The process began with administrative murder, the systematic elimination of documentary evidence that someone had ever lived within the imperial compound. Court scribes received orders to remove specific names from daily attendance rolls, meal distribution lists, and ceremonial protocols. These bureaucrats understood that their own survival depended on thorough compliance with erasure orders. So they developed techniques for removing entries from bound volumes without leaving evidence that alterations had occurred. The fate of dismissed concubines varied according to their perceived threat level and the political calculations of whoever ordered their removal. Low-ranking girls who had committed minor infractions might simply disappear from palace records while being quietly married to provincial officials and exiled to distant territories. These forced marriages served multiple purposes. They removed potential embarrassments from the capital while rewarding loyal servants with wives whose harem training made them exceptionally skilled in domestic management. More dangerous cases required permanent solutions that left no possibility of future complications. European intelligence reports from the 17th century reference a location called the Old Palace, or Eski Saray, where forgotten women allegedly spent their remaining years in comfortable imprisonment. Diplomats who managed to gather intelligence about this facility described it as a luxurious tomb where former concubines lived in silence among their own failed ambitions, forbidden to marry, reproduce, or maintain contact with the outside world. Contemporary accounts suggest that some erasures were more literal than administrative. Palace records from the reign of Murad IV reference investigations into witchcraft and treason charges that appear to have been pretexts for eliminating specific concubines whose existence had become politically inconvenient. These cases allegedly involved trials conducted in secret, with evidence that was never documented and sentences that were never officially recorded. The accused simply vanished, their chambers reassigned, their possessions redistributed, and their names spoken in past tense by the few who dared remember them at all. The psychological impact of witnessing these erasures created a permanent atmosphere of terror among surviving concubines. Women understood that their own memories might someday become criminal evidence if they recalled the wrong person or mentioned the wrong name. This fear of remembering transformed the harem into a community of selective amnesia, where residents learned to forget their own experiences in real time, to avoid sharing the fate of the disappeared. Some concubines attempted to preserve traces of their existence through hidden messages, secret diaries, or coded communications with the outside world. Palace security operations allegedly focused significant resources on detecting and eliminating these attempts at historical preservation. Searches of concubines' quarters became routine, with eunuchs specifically trained to identify signs of unauthorized writing, hidden correspondence, or any attempt to create permanent records of daily life within the imperial compound. The few documented attempts at escape reveal the impossibility of leaving the harem system even through successful flight. A case from 1623 describes a concubine named Layla, who managed to flee the palace disguised as a servant, only to be recaptured 3 days later trying to board a Genoese merchant vessel. Rather than being punished publicly, she was returned to the harem where she lived for 2 more years, before dying of what physicians termed melancholic fever, a condition that contemporary medical understanding suggests might have been suicide by starvation or poison. The destruction of physical evidence extended to architectural modifications that erased the spatial memory of eliminated individuals. Chambers were subdivided, redecorated, or converted to different uses in ways that made it impossible for surviving residents to maintain accurate mental maps of who had lived where. This spatial amnesia complemented the documentary erasure, creating an environment where the past became literally unrecognizable, even to those who had experienced it. The international implications of these disappearances occasionally created diplomatic complications when European powers inquired about the fate of specific captured noblewomen or purchased slaves. Ottoman officials developed sophisticated protocols for responding to such inquiries, with plausible explanations that satisfied foreign curiosity, without admitting to systematic elimination practices. Missing persons were reported to have died of natural causes, been married to distant officials, or chosen religious seclusion. explanations that were impossible to verify but difficult to disprove. Yet the ultimate purpose of these erasures wasn't simply to eliminate inconvenient individuals. It was to maintain the harem's function as a political institution that transcended any single person's story. By ensuring that failed concubines left no trace, the system preserved its mythology of perfect success, while hiding the mathematical reality that the vast majority of participants were destined for elimination from the start. This systematic erasure wasn't just about removing women from history, it was about maintaining a political system that depended on the illusion that power flowed from merit, beauty, and divine favor, rather than from survival instincts honed in an environment designed to destroy human connection and individual identity. The real revelation of the Ottoman harem system wasn't its cruelty, it was its efficiency as a machine for manufacturing political power through the systematic destruction of human bonds. While European courts struggled with succession crises, noble rebellions, and dynastic wars, the Ottomans created a system where the empire's most important decisions were made by women who had been deliberately isolated from every traditional source of female influence: family, homeland, religious community, and personal relationships. The Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, wielded authority that would have been impossible for any European queen. She controlled the imperial treasury, approved high-level appointments, negotiated with foreign ambassadors, and effectively governed the domestic affairs of an empire spanning 3 continents. This power came precisely because she had no competing loyalties. Her family was dead or forgotten, her homeland was a memory, and her survival depended entirely on her son's success. The harem system had created the perfect political instrument, a ruler with unlimited motivation and no conflicting interests. The intelligence network that emerged from this system rivaled any modern espionage operation. Concubines who were married to provincial governors maintained correspondence with their former sisters in the capital, creating information channels that kept the central government informed about regional developments with remarkable accuracy. These women, trained in observation and survival, proved exceptionally skilled at gathering political intelligence from their husbands while maintaining the appearance of decorative domesticity. The economic implications of harem politics influenced trade routes, military campaigns, and diplomatic alliances across the known world. When the Valide Sultan Nurbanu developed a preference for Venetian silk, trade agreements between the Ottoman Empire and Venice shifted to accommodate her tastes. When Safavieh Sultan conceived a dislike for Persian carpets, commercial relationships with Safavid Iran suffered measurable consequences. European merchants learned to factor harem preferences into their business calculations, understanding that access to Ottoman markets might depend on satisfying the aesthetic opinions of women whose names they could never speak publicly. The religious dimension of harem power created particularly complex political dynamics. These women, many of whom had been raised Christian, became zealous defenders of Islamic orthodoxy, partly as protection against accusations of divided loyalty. Their conversions weren't just personal spiritual journeys but political necessities, and their subsequent devotion often exceeded that of born Muslims. This phenomenon created a class of Islamic advocates whose fervor was intensified by their need to prove belonging in a system that had defined them as perpetual outsiders. The succession planning that took place within harem walls determined not just who would rule the Ottoman Empire, but how that rule would be exercised. Different Valide sultans promoted different philosophies of governance based on their analysis of political survival requirements. Some advocated aggressive military expansion to keep potential rivals busy with external conflicts. Others promoted internal development projects that increased imperial wealth while providing employment for potentially troublesome populations. The training protocols developed within the harem for educating young princes created rulers whose psychological development had been shaped by an environment of absolute female authority. These future sultans grew up understanding that women could wield power as effectively as men, but only if they had been properly prepared for the exercise of authority through systematic elimination of traditional feminine characteristics like compassion, sentimentality, and loyalty to anyone except the imperial system itself. The cultural influence of harem graduates extended far beyond politics into architecture, literature, music, and religious practice. Women who had been trained in the palace carried their aesthetic sensibilities and organizational skills into their subsequent roles as wives of high officials, creating a distinctive Ottoman elite culture that synthesized influences from across the empire's diverse territories. This cultural synthesis wasn't the result of natural evolution, but of deliberate programming designed to create a ruling class with shared values and compatible methods. The international diplomatic implications of harem politics influenced relationships between the Ottoman Empire and its European neighbors in ways that traditional political analysis often missed. Marriage negotiations, trade agreements, and military alliances were sometimes decided by women whose existence European diplomats couldn't officially acknowledge, but whose preferences determined the success or failure of major international initiatives. Yet, this extraordinary concentration of female power came at a cost that transcended individual tragedy to become a systematic assault on human nature itself. The women who reached the heights of imperial authority had been selected and trained for their ability to suppress the emotional connections that define normal human experience. Their power was real, but it was the power of survivors who had learned to thrive in an environment designed to destroy everything that made life worth living. Today, tourists walk through Topkapi Palace's renovated chambers, admiring the geometric perfection of Ottoman architecture, while following guided tours that describe the harem as a luxury spa, where beautiful women lived pampered lives of leisure. The marble floors shine under LED lighting, and museum placards describe the political influence of various Valide Sultans, without mentioning the systematic destruction of human bonds that made their authority possible. Visitors photograph jeweled coffee cups and silk cushions while walking over floors that once echoed with the footsteps of girls whose names were deliberately forgotten. The sanitized museum presentation isn't accidental. It reflects our modern discomfort with acknowledging systems that achieved political stability through methods that violate every contemporary assumption about human rights, individual dignity, and personal autonomy. We prefer to imagine historical oppression as crude and obvious rather than sophisticated and effective, because admitting the success of systematic dehumanization forces uncomfortable questions about our own institutional arrangements. The women who survived this system and achieved power within it weren't victims in any simple sense. They were collaborators in their own transformation, active participants in an arrangement that destroyed some aspects of their humanity while developing others to extraordinary degrees. Their intelligence, adaptability, and political skills were genuine achievements, but achievements that came at the cost of their capacity for trust, authentic relationships, and connection to anything beyond the imperial system that had created them. The modern tendency to romanticize historical concubinage as somehow empowering reflects our inability to process the reality that humans can adapt to systems that systematically violate their fundamental needs, while convincing themselves that their adaptation represents choice rather than survival. The women of the Ottoman Harem developed remarkable skills and achieved significant power, but these accomplishments occurred within a framework designed to prevent them from imagining alternatives to their captivity. Standing in these renovated chambers today, you can still feel the weight of systematic silence that was once the first rule imposed on girls who entered these walls with names, languages, and memories of lives that had to die to make room for what they would become. The geometric patterns carved into marble walls create acoustic effects that once carried whispered intelligence reports and muffled screams with equal clarity, but now they only echo with the comfortable chatter of tourists discussing lunch plans and photo opportunities. The gift shop at the exit sells postcards featuring romanticized paintings of harem life, images of women lounging on silk cushions, playing musical instruments, and gazing dreamily into ornate mirrors. These artistic fantasies, created by European painters who never set foot inside the actual harem, have become more historically influential than the documented experiences of the women who lived and died within these walls. We prefer these comfortable lies to the documented reality that the harem was never about pleasure or luxury. It was about power, and power requires the systematic elimination of everything that makes us human. If you close your eyes in these marble halls and listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of that first command every girl received upon arrival. Forget your name, but everything it represented. Your father's voice calling you home for dinner, your mother's songs during evening prayers, your sister's laughter during festival celebrations, your own dreams of growing up, falling in love, raising children who would know their grandparents' stories. All of it had to die so that something else could be born, something useful, something controllable, something that could wield power without being constrained by human attachments that might interfere with imperial calculations. The Ottoman harem wasn't just a palace of women. It was a factory that manufactured power from the raw material of destroyed lives, producing rulers who could make decisions unclouded by compassion, loyalty, or love. The silence that governed these halls wasn't just an absence of sound. It was the systematic elimination of human voice, human memory, and human connection. It was the rule that made all other rules possible, because once you learn to forget your own name, forgetting everything else becomes just another survival skill. The harem was never about training girls to please men. It was about training them to survive a system designed to train, rank, and erase, until nothing remained but the useful parts. The intelligence without curiosity, the beauty without self-love, the power without humanity. And in the end, that silence was its most perfect achievement and its most damning legacy. Because the most successful graduates of this system were the women who learned not just to accept their erasure, but to participate in it, until they became indistinguishable from the machine that had created them. The marble remembers nothing, but somewhere in these walls, in the spaces between the decorative patterns and the renovated chambers, the silence still echoes with the voices of girls who were taught to forget their names so completely that history forgot them too. If you enjoyed this story, you'll also like the story of the most inbred man in European history. Watch it next.